We drove into Braxton from the north on the main highway. I'd wanted to ask more questions after the things Holloman had said, but I decided to wait and see instead. Whatever this place was, whatever all of this was, I couldn't just keep blindly following whatever my employers told me. This was no longer just about my job. It was about my life. So instead of asking questions and swallowing whatever answers I got, I kept quiet and paid attention as we traveled into the city limits of Braxton. There was a large building coming up on the left, and squinting, I could just make out the sign running along the roofline 5 stories up. It was a hospital. Oh my God! That was Mrs. Graves, her voice soft and trembling with enough fear that it derailed my train of thought and caused me to follow her gaze to a large, dark mound out on the grounds of the hospital. Mr. Holloman was slowing down now as he sucked air between his teeth and muttered, "God damn it," under his breath. I only noticed his reaction distantly, however, as I squinted out the window and tried to understand what we were all looking at. When I did, my stomach twisted into a cramp as my gorge began to rise. It was bodies. A large heap of bodies that had obviously been partially burned at one point and then left rotting for weeks or months. There were still patches of clothes and hair and desiccated flesh, but mostly it was a mound of bones melded into a bleak little hill by time and decay. A few more people were scattered about, some obviously dead, but others almost like, are some of those people sleeping? Are there people out there in that still alive and fucking sleeping? Mrs. Graves met my eyes before putting her hand on Hollyman's arm. "We don't need to stop here. This isn't a good place to start." He shot her a dark look, his tone harsh. "I'm not an idiot. I know." Stopping himself, he let out a long sigh. "I'm sorry, Gracie. I'm afraid, and that makes me short-tempered. But I shouldn't take it out on you." She patted his arm. "I know. It's okay. But let's go on into town and see what we can see." She turned back to look at me. "You okay with that too?" Heart pounding, I forced myself to stop glancing out the window and sit back in my seat. Yeah, it's got to be better than here." We drove on toward the town proper, Holloman taking a slow and cautious route that cut up and down the occasional side street before moving back to the main road on a trajectory toward what street signs said was downtown Braxton. None of us talked as we went, but I could feel our collective fear and anxiety growing every mile we drove deeper into that place. There were people laying in cars, sprawled out near or sometimes in the streets, slumped against buildings, and curled up in yards as we passed. I couldn't say for sure with all of them. Only some would occasionally twitch, and so were obviously alive. But most of them didn't really look dead. Just asleep. The surreal strangeness of it all was made 100 times worse by some of the other things scattered around amid the slumbering citizenry of Braxton. Wrecked cars, burned out buildings, bodies that definitely were dead because they'd been torn apart and were rotting. Amid all of this were numerous dark splashes and stains that looked like the faded remnants of old horrors, a slaughter that happened here before the survivors decided to curl up and take a long winter's nap. It was all terrifying, but even worse, it was impossible. How could any of this be happening? Didn't you say this started months ago? Graves nodded as she glanced back to the rear seat. Or longer? Yes. I frowned at her. So, how does that make sense? The bodies and stuff. Maybe they're decaying like they would over that much time in the elements. Because how would I know, right? I'm no expert, though to me, even that stuff seems like it's fresher than it would be after that long outside. But let's set that aside. I leaned forward and pointed to the closest sidewalk, where a pair of cops were laying against each other outside of a downtown store called You So and So. How are these people still alive? How haven't they starved to death? Frozen to death? Been eaten by bugs or wolves or whatever the fuck? It makes no sense. Letting out a sigh, Holloman pulled into an empty parking space and turned off the car. Clint. And why wouldn't people know about this place? Why wouldn't it be in the national news if everyone just started killing each other here and then fell asleep? He turned to face me, his voice hard but not cruel. Clint, stop. Listen, please. Sucking in a breath, I nodded. Okay, yeah. Yeah. Listening. Holloman glanced at Graves and then back to me. Good. First off, we don't have all the answers. We know this is where we're supposed to go and have some idea of what we'd find here and what we need to do. But we don't have answers for everything. He paused for a moment before going on, his words softer and more measured. That being said, this phenomena is being caused by something in or near this town. An infection, for lack of a better term. Seeing my eyes widen, he raised his hand. Not that kind of infection. I don't know that it's contagious anymore, and even if it was, well, the three of us should be inoculated against its effects. Inoculated? What are you talking about? I haven't had a shot for this shit. Graves gave me a small smile. Not a shot. Your service, your work with us. It grants you a measure of protection too. It keeps you able to do the work that's needed. I had 100 questions, but I had to be smart and selective if I was going to get anything useful out of them. Okay, so we'll just let that go for now. What about the other? Why don't people know about this, and how are these people all still alive? Holloman pursed his lips. When this first happened, I think it really was like an infection, spreading throughout the town and anyone who it came across. But once it had enough people, the infection changed. The people it had driven crazy, they started to sleep, and to dream. And the reality around this place began to thicken and harden like a pearl. In the world, but not of it. Forgotten except by those that stumbled upon it by accident. Then why wouldn't one of those people? I trailed off as I looked at my phone. No signal. I could hear fresh fear in my voice when I spoke again. This place is a trap, isn't it? Graves was looking out the window when she spoke. It certainly looks that way. I don't know that it's meant to be specifically, but I think it's removed from normal reality in such a way that the effect is largely the same. I felt my tongue growing thick in my mouth. So you can get in but not back out, like a fucking roach motel. I asked the next question, afraid I already knew the answer. Can we leave? Holloman gave a slight shake of his head. As things stand at the moment, number. But there is a way to stop what's happening here, to reconcile this place back into our world. Then we'll be able to leave again. My jaw was clenching as I stared at him. Why didn't you fucking tell me we couldn't leave before we wandered in here? Graves did turn and look at me then. We honestly didn't know for sure. And we think we have to have you with us for this. For this all to work properly. I grimaced at her. What is this? What do we have to do to unfuck this place and get to leave? It's our understanding that there is a mine underneath this town. She pointed her long, thin finger down and bored through the air like a drill headed for the heart of the earth. A very old and deep hole that for some reason the people of this town started mining again a while back. They dug up and woke up, something even older than the hole down there. Licking her lips, she gave a nervous laugh. And now we have to find it and kill it. My chest was on fire as we cut down another side street. Holloman was lagging behind, croaking out breathless directions as he tried to read the map while staying ahead of the growing mob behind us. We were going to die here. None of us really knew where we were going. Mrs. Graves's arm was bleeding steadily from where that kid had stuck her a few minutes earlier. It might be enough to kill her in time, but that wouldn't be a problem. The people of Braxton would tear us apart long before then. Keep her head still, They're starting to twitch more, and it has to get in at the inner canthus precisely to have a full effect. Nodding, I leaned forward, my knees digging into the dreaming woman's shoulders as I tightened my inner thigh's grip on the sides of her head. We had done this more than 50 times in the last 3 hours, and I was getting very tired. But Graves was right. They were starting to fight back a bit more. We'd started with the 2 cops outside of You So and So. Graves got me to lay them both out flat on their backs and straddle their heads while putting weight on their shoulders in case they have a sudden reaction to the elixir. I wanted to ask what kind of reaction that might be, but I held my tongue for the moment. Holding the larger man's head steady, I'd opened his left eye as instructed, while Graves dripped a single drop of elixir into it. The effect had been subtle, but immediate. The twitching tension that had been in the man's body had melted away, replaced instead by soft, heavy snoring. When I met Graves's eyes, she nodded with a small smile. He's truly sleeping now. I frowned in return. He wasn't before. Graves shook her head. Not a natural sleep, no. He was in a state of induced dreaming. The elixir has freed him from that. I'd kept quiet then, but by the time we reached this latest woman, who went from violently spasming to sleeping peacefully with a single drop from Graves, I couldn't help myself. What is it? The elixir, I mean. Clint. No. You guys say you want me here. Need me. Okay, I'm here. Fucking trapped here, apparently. So do me a solid and stop jerking me around. She sighed and glanced around. Holloman had gone off to find a map of the town or some other source of information. Before he left, I'd asked why he didn't just search the internet before we came here. He gave me a hollow laugh and shrugged. Said he tried, but the world has forgotten this place exists, and not just in people's memories. That reminder of how isolated we were here had been troubling, but Graves's expression was somehow worse. There was a degree of mistrust and fear in Graves's face as she checked that her partner was not around. Were they not as united and in control as they wanted me to believe? And if not, what did that mean for our odds of escaping this place? Satisfied we were alone, she turned back to me. The elixir is a substance that comes from the one we serve. Like they make it for you. For us. Her expression grew haunted. In a sense, yes. Not in a laboratory or factory, though. It is Essen. I found a map of the town finally. We both jumped slightly as Holloman approached. Turning to him, I saw his expression was growing hard. What are you two talking about? I shook my head as I stood up from the sleeping woman, legs slightly trembling. Nothing. Does the map show us where we need to go? Holloman grimaced slightly. Potentially, yes. It's one of these poorly drawn tourist maps. The detail is there, but the scale, I don't know. But it does show a historic mine in the western edge of the city. I'd guess that'll be where we find what we're looking for. He gestured down at the sleeping woman. Though we've got to work faster if we're going to get to that point anytime soon. He looked at Graves. How many have you done so far? She licked her lips. 53 with this woman. Frowning, he shook his head slightly. Not nearly enough yet. I stepped forward. So how many is enough? And enough for what? He shifted his gaze back to me. Enough to weaken the grip of the thing living here. To give us a chance of not dying when we confront it. Swallowing, I dropped my eyes. Okay. So does that mean we have to do everyone still alive in the town? He shook his head. No, just a percentage need to be dosed. According to this map, back in 2014, the town's population was about 9,000 people. From what we've seen and been told, I'd guess that less than 2,000 of those are probably still alive. If we dose 10% of that number, we should be safe by 200 or so. I groaned. Fuck, that'll take all night. Holloman shrugged and gave a hard smile. Do you have other plans? He snorted. Besides, I found a gymnasium 3 blocks over. It looks like some of the townspeople were hiding there before they got infected and fell asleep. Graves had been putting her bottle of elixir back in its satchel, but she paused and looked up now. How many are in there? Holloman didn't meet her eyes, but instead looked back down the way he'd came. Alive? Hard to say for sure. There are a few dead in there too, but if I had to guess, it's close to 100. She glanced at me and nodded. Okay then, let's go. The outside of the gymnasium proudly proclaimed itself to be home of the Braxton Barbarians, a name that was ironically apt given everything that had happened there. Bodies and signs of long-past fighting littered the parking lot as we made our way toward the building. We found a couple of sleepers amid the chaos, but most were truly dead here. The carnage got much worse as we reached the double doors leading into the gym. A couple of dozen bodies lay in a jumbled pile of slow rot at the entry point. I could see several holes that were probably gunshots on a number of the people, and the outside of the doors were streaked with bloody finger trails and dents, along with one long breach of the metal from a fire axe that was still lodged in the right door. Gagging a little, I had to fight the urge to just close my eyes and block it all out. Jesus, it was like a war here. They were trying to get into the others, weren't they? Holloman puffed out a breath and nodded. Yes, it looks that way. For whatever reason, some people weren't affected as quickly as others. Maybe they tried to leave town and couldn't. Or maybe by the time they realized how bad things were, all they could do was try to hide in here. Stepping over a dead teenaged girl, he yanked open the door with a squeal. They chained the door from the inside, but they left a gap to shoot through. I found some bolt cutters at a hardware store back the way we came and took care of the chain, but we still probably want to block this door open when we go in. He gave me a weary glance. Don't want to be trapped in there if things go sour. Graves touched Holloman's shoulder. Do you think it's dangerous in there? He shrugged but didn't turn to look at her. Dangerous? Yes. They all seem asleep though. And this whole place is dangerous. The quicker we can get done, the less risk we have of running into something unexpected and nasty. Pulling out a small flashlight, he stepped inside and we followed. The first room was a large atrium with 2 sets of double doors on the far side leading into the gym proper. Spare chairs and tables had been piled against another exterior door down at the far end, and clustered around that pile were 2 men and a woman, all alive and twitching from down in the belly of some deep dream. Graves gestured to them. We may as well get these before we venture inside. Holloman frowned but nodded. Yes, I suppose so, but let's hurry. 5 minutes later, the 3 were all truly asleep, and we were stepping into the gymnasium. The murk of the faint fading daylight coming in through the few grimy windows gave an illusion of normalcy at first. There were a few signs of what were probably discarded makeshift weapons, but no bodies or slumbering people at first. It wasn't until our lights reached the far corner of the gym that we saw the enormous mound of flesh that lay dreaming. Oh my God, Graves's voice trembled slightly as she took a few steps forward to get a better look. They're sleeping amid the dead, aren't they? Did they choose to do that? To sleep in that? Holloman nodded. I think so. The putrefaction is oddly slow in this place, and these people were likely all insane when they fell asleep, so I suppose it made some sense to them. My own voice was barely above a whisper when I spoke. Who are the dead people? In here, why did some die and some live? Graves spoke up. My guess is that not everyone got infected or turned at the same rate. The ones that were too slow or somehow immune to it got killed by the rest before being turned into bedding. Tears sprang to my eyes as the sudden urge to vomit overtook me. Doubling over, I vomited onto the dirty edge of what had once been a basketball court. Holloman patted my back. I did the same thing earlier. It's for the best. It'll make what we have to do easier. Throat burning. I gave him a sidelong glance. What's that? We need to pull all the dreamers free of that, so we can give them the elixir. An hour later, we had dislodged 40 or so people from the Hill of Death and dreaming that occupied darkest part of the gym. I'd vomited twice more. Once when we pulled the first man free, and again when we hit a pocket of firm dead flesh holding a pair of women tightly. It should have been long withered away, but instead it was spongy and resistant to our attempts to yank the women out. It took all three of us pulling at the first woman and kicking at the rotten mess around her to break her free, and when she came out, it was with a soft, liquid pop that filled the air with a foul smell that took my breath away. We pulled her away quickly and then grabbed the second, but we were only a few feet away from the mound when I had to stop and retch again. Wiping my mouth, I helped them slide her the rest of the way to where we had lined up the others on the far side of the gym. Why don't we do this batch and then get more? I spit again, more to get the smell off my tongue than the bile from retching. I need a break from going into that. Graves looked at the pile and then at the twitching bodies we had laid out across the gym floor. I think we're less than halfway done with what's in there, but this is a good starting point. We can move them into the front room when we're done to make room for the rest. She looked at Holliman. Sound good to you? He nodded. Yes, let's just hurry. It'll be dark soon. We were halfway done with the first batch when it happened. At the time, I was too terrified to consider the why of it all, and looking back on it later, I just chalked it up to our being tired and in the routine of doing the same strange and horrible task over and over. And I guess that was my first mistake. It wasn't exactly the same thing over and over. Because with every person we took from dreaming, the others grew more restless. I think we all realized this was building towards something bad, but our wordless agreement was just to work faster. Get it over with so we could somehow finish whatever was happening in this town and get out. I think about that attitude now, and ironically enough, I marvel at it. I had no real idea of what we were facing or how we were supposed to beat it, but through some amalgam of desperate faith in Holliman and Graves and desperation at our situation, I trusted that it would work out, so long as we had a plan and kept to it. That's probably why, when Graves cried out and shoved me off the man I was steadying for the elixir, there was no fear, just irritated surprise. It all happened so fast. She shoved me. I turned toward her even as I saw a blur of movement from behind. Someone small with a piece of metal or a knife stabbing the air where I had been and hitting Mrs. Graves's arm instead. She let out a scream and reached for the attacker's wrist even as I was catching myself and trying to regain my balance so I could help. The air was suddenly split by the crack of a gunshot, and the small boy holding a butcher knife went tumbling back a couple of feet before sliding a few more. My eyes followed him first. I could already see blood pooling from his chest, and even at a distance it was easy to tell he was dead in the moment before I turned to look for the source of the gunfire. It was Mr. Holliman, his eyes wide and roving as he looked around the gym and then at Mrs. Graves, his shocked expression narrowing to one of angry concern. "Gracie, are you okay?" She was cradling her arm and looked pale, but she managed to nod between deep, panicked breaths. Yes, I think so." She gave him a smile before looking over at me. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, thanks to... Ha. Hey. Ha 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 ha." It wasn't the laughter of one person or just a few. In fact, at first it seemed less like laughter than it did trickles of dirty water, crawling through new cracks in a dam, growing more eager and numerous with every second. I looked toward the dark corner of the room, and saw what was crawling towards us wasn't foul streams, but madness given legs and hands and teeth. Dozens of dreamers now woken back into whatever plague held this place. Crawling and standing with the rotting muck of their family and friends clinging to their bodies, as they picked up left-behind weapons and started to stand and walk towards us, every lip curled into a smile between chuckles and cackles and guffaws. Ha ha ha! He, hey! I turned to look at Holloman as he was stepping forward to lift Mrs. Graves to her feet and pull her toward the exit. He gave me a silent glance that told me all I needed to know. This was not according to plan. This was not in control. And if we didn't get away from this place and these people, we were all going to die. We'd made it back through the maze of downtown to the side opposite from the gym, but it didn't matter. Not only were the ones from the gym still after us, along with a few more dreamers they'd picked up along the way, but up ahead was another group of 15 or so men and women were running towards us with impromptu tools and manic grins that both flashed murder with each bouncing step closer. They were practically skipping towards us as they guffawed and giggled, and it might have been funny if not for the dead ice in their eyes. Jesus, in here! Spotted the garage door of an old-fashioned service station across the street. It was propped open a foot by a cinder block, and while it might have been a trap set to lure us in, I didn't really think the people of Braxton had had the time or the sense to arrange it so quickly. These people, they didn't move or look right, and not just because they were crazy and trying to kill us. They all looked off somehow. Maybe it was the way they moved, or the loose way the skin hung on their cheeks, even when pulled back with their fishhook smiles. They were becoming something different, though whether it was less or more, I couldn't say. All of those thoughts were in the back of my mind as we rushed over to the door, and I tried to pull it up further for Mrs. Graves and Mr. Holloman to crawl under. The door only budged a few more inches before it let out a protesting rusty squeal and would go no further. Graves had already rolled through the gap, leaving a smear of blood in her wake, and Holloman was grunting as he sucked in his stomach and pulled himself past the door. Gasping with exhaustion and terror, I looked over my shoulder to see how far away the crowds were. The one cutting us off was still some distance away, though they were moving fast, but the ones behind us since the gym were 30 yards at most. I dropped to my belly and rolled through the gap, kicking the cinder block free as I went. It all happened in a few harried seconds, but as I was getting to my knees, I already realized the problem. The block had been so easy to kick away because the door hadn't dropped back down when I let go to scoot under it. It was stuck, and as I stood up and started pulling on the other side, it immediately became clear that neither me nor Holloman's frenzied yanks and kicks were doing much good. "Back here, there are tires. Wedge them under." Mrs. Graves's voice was soft but strident, cutting through my panic as I followed her words to the back wall of the garage. There were several stacks of old tires back there, including several truck tires big enough to block the door gap if put end to end. Holloman ran with me to the back, yanking tires down and sliding them across the concrete floor to jam them into the space between the ground and the edge of the door. They were on the other side, clawing and pounding and laughing their heads off as they told us to let them in. But either they didn't catch on that we were plugging the hole they could crawl through, or they just didn't care. A couple of minutes later, we had 5 tires jammed across the opening. With the last bit of space partially blocked by a heavy-duty hand truck, we stuffed into the corner and ran through with chain to the last tire so it wouldn't be easily removed. Yet for all that, I knew it would only take a few minutes for the mob to dismantle our defenses, and that's assuming they couldn't force the door up themselves. I looked over and saw the same worries on the faces of Holloman and Graves. She looked past me and nodded towards the far corner. "There's a door back there. You better go close it in case they come in that way." Turning fast, I saw what she meant, an open door that seemed to lead to the store part of the gas station. Hard in my throat, I went to the door and peered through it. The store itself still seemed empty and intact, but I could see more and more people gathering outside. I jerked backward, afraid they might see me through the glass, despite the darkness inside the store. But peeking back out a few moments later, there was no sign that they had. Still, they'd seen us go in here, right? Why weren't they coming in after us? Stepping back through the door and closing it behind me, I quietly slid over a mechanic's creeper and propped it under the knob before turning back to my employers. Holloman had managed to tourniquet Mrs. Graves's upper arm with her belt and bandage her forearm with a strip from his shirt. And while the strip of cloth was already turning red with blood, it was definitely an improvement from how she'd looked a few minutes earlier. Other, of course, from the fact that she looked as terrified as I felt. I walked back over to them, keeping my voice low. Why aren't they coming in? There's more around on the store side, but they weren't even really looking in through the windows. It's like they forgot we're in here. Holloman grimaced and gave a nod. That's probably exactly what has happened. We need to be very careful to not make noise or let them see us. I frowned at him. But how does that work? Are they like so crazy or brain damaged that they don't remember chasing us in here just now? Graves shook her head. No, I don't think so. Based on what we've seen and what we know, they may be insane, but they retain a large degree of sophistication. I think this is just, well, a measure of protection we're being provided by our service, even here. I felt a flare of anger at her carefully chosen words. Oh, so more magic from our service. What exactly do we serve again? Because I seem to always miss out on that part. Holloman started turning red. Clint, now is not... I raised my hand and cut him off. Fuck it. Just save your bullshit. You're actually right. We're about to die, and I'd rather focus on that not happening. Any ideas? I glanced between the two of them. Either of you? A look passed between them, and then Holloman glanced toward the shadowy back corner of the garage. I don't think there's another way out of here, but even if there was, they'd just be after us again as soon as we ran. But if they're that discombobulated... Clint, how many do you think are out there right now? I shook my head. Shit, I don't know. There were probably 30 or 40 following us, right? And another 12 or 15 trying to cut us off. I glanced back toward the store side of the gas station. But when I was closing the door, I could see out the windows pretty good, and... yeah, there are still more coming. Holloman fluttered his hand in frustration. Yes, I understand. But how many? By your best guess? Scowling, I gave a shrug. I don't know. Probably 100 or more, if none of them are leaving again. He gave me a grim smile. Good. That may be enough. Enough for what? Wiping his forehead, he gestured up at the fluorescent light sullenly illuminating the dingy garage we were in. Have you wondered about the electricity? Not every place has power, it seems, but some do. And where is that coming from? Is there an active power plant within the bubble of this place, filled with giggling electricians and engineers that are keeping the lights on? Or are there power lines running outside the bubble to where time and nature move differently? Some kind of lifeline to the world outside this. He waved around at the garage, his face contorted with disgust. This insane hell? He waggled a finger. Number neither. The thing that has taken this place and its people is keeping the lights on. Keeping the people asleep until now, feeding on their dreams and using a bit of that power to maintain certain things for whatever reasons. Perhaps to more easily lure in the occasional traveler, though that's just a guess. And it doesn't matter. What does matter is that it takes resources, and the more dreamers we take from it, the weaker it will become. I rolled my eyes. Well, no shit. But I don't think these fuckers are going to let us get near them with the eyedropper. And they don't look too sleepy either. Holloman started to give an angry reply when Mrs. Graves put a hand on his arm. And my own. When they were in that dream state, the elixir was the only way to end that connection. If we had simply gone around and killed them, their deaths would have provided a powerful boost to this thing. Perhaps more than just letting it feed on them until they could no longer be sustained. It would have been akin to a ritual sacrifice. I felt my stomach twist as I saw where this was heading. And now, She let out a long, tired sigh. Now it has had to wake up part of them, sacrificing the power of their dreams to create a standing army to eliminate a threat, us. Unless and until they sleep again, that power is lost, Holloman cut in. And if you're right, and there are 100 or more out there, and given those we've already dosed, we could move past the breaking point in one fell swoop. I stared at her. You're talking about killing them, aren't you? Murdering 100 people. Graves shook her head. Not murder. Self-defense. They will kill us eventually, and in horrible ways. This place, we're trapped here. Hard as it may be to hear, it's going to be either them or us. Holloman snorted. Enough of this. We can moralize after we're no longer in danger. He pointed to the abandoned sedans sitting in the far corner of the garage. Clint, go look for gas and oil. If you can't find much, see if you can siphon some from that car. I guess we'll need at least 20 gallons to spray them all down. I backed up a step. What are you talking about? You're going to walk out there and what? Spray them down with oil and gas and set them on fire? He chuckled. That'd be suicide. Don't be an idiot. He pointed to a skylight above the sedan. I'm going to have you pry that open, and we'll go onto the roof and spray it down on them. If we're careful and they don't see us, they may just let us do it until it's too late. But first you need to find something liquid that will burn. I looked back at Graves. And you're okay with this? She looked on the edge of tears. I'm not okay with any of this, but we don't have a choice. We have a job to do, and they will kill us otherwise. Please, Clint. Holloman looked ready to argue further, but I cut him off. Save it. I'm doing this because you're both right. That doesn't mean I like it. He nodded. I appreciate that. I feel the same way. Will you please go find us some flammables while I stay with Gracie? Sure. Yeah, sure. The garage was big enough to hold 2 cars at a time, but with only the one slot occupied, I didn't think there'd be much to really search. Most of the walls were lined with tools. There were miscellaneous pieces of equipment along the perimeter, but it wasn't until I started around the car that I saw something of interest. It was a pair of feet. I let out a gasp and started to back away, but something stopped me. This wasn't right. The feet were laying at a weird angle and looked lifeless. Taking a couple of steps forward, I could see more of the man's body. He had clearly been dead a while, though it was to tell how long in this place, and it wasn't hard to see how he died. A box cutter still lay clasped in his withered hand, stained from the gash he'd put in his own neck at the end. I thought about the cinder block at the door, and wondered if he was the one that had put that there, maybe hoping someone else would come along and rescue him for a time before he gave up hope. Tears springing to my eyes, I looked over at his other hand. It was a plastic grocery bag, and inside were the dried ruins of what had probably once been half an ice cream cake, along with plastic plates, candles, and other party supplies. Jesus, this looks like he was going to his kid's birthday party. I stumbled back a step before my eyes caught on a large metal drum in the corner. Black painted letters were stenciled along the side, with the first line saying 50 gallons. Below that was a longer line. Waste oil. Stepping cautionally by the poor dead man, I gingerly rocked it. It felt most of the way full. Sighing, I looked back down at the birthday bag. When I came back around, Graves and Holloman were looking at me with expectant desperation. I nodded. I found a drum back here. I think it has like 30 or 40 gallons of old oil in there. I threw a small plastic bag at Holloman's chest. Flinching, he fumblingly grabbed it and looked at it before giving me a sullen stare. Party balloons. His face split into a grin as he began to laugh softly. Oh, I see. Yes, that should work well. Yes. Yeah, let's hurry and get this done. Come help me get the barrel out. Easing up from his spot next to Mrs. Graves, he bustled over past me, still chuckling. Sure thing, Chief. Time for a fire tonight. Frowning at him, I turned to look back at Graves, her eyes wide and more fearful than when we'd barely escaped the mob outside. She was mouthing something to me, lips trembling as she tried to enunciate each word clearly across the shadowy space. We're losing him.